All right. Title of my presentation today, Taming Behemoths, Agile Backlog Grooming Strategies to Increase Business Value and Peace of Mind, especially peace of mind. My name is Andrew Lindsay. I work for a company called New Mode that does digital advocacy tools that NGOs use on their websites. For about 10 odd years of my career, I've been working in Agile in one form or another with folks like McGill and the Linux Foundation and New Mode now. And through that, I've gone and done a bunch of the fancy Agile certifications, like the PMI ACP or the Certified Scrum Professional, Scrum Master, Product Owner stuff. All that to say just that I've spent a fair amount of time over the last decade thinking about this stuff and trying to get it right, not always successfully. Definitely to this day still learning lessons, but still convinced that it's been fairly beneficial to me with dev teams in terms of getting things done efficiently and effectively. I put the slides for this up tinyurl.com/newmode-DrupalCamp. And if folks are looking to get a hold of me later on, it's Mirbuck on D.O on Twitter and Andrew@newmode.net by email. So I'll ask the question, you mentioned already that you do Agile at work, and I know that Matt certainly does. Is everyone in this room sort of in an atmosphere where they're doing work with Agile teams, or is it fairly new to some folks? So it seems like everybody's got at least some level of experience. All right, I'm going to be very brief with the vocabulary then. So Agile, a principled collaborative approach to software development. Some people get really upset when you call it a methodology. I don't know that I'm one of those people. Scrum, a framework within Agile that's used to do work in an iterative fashion where you're doing sprints, usually in 2-week increments, but sometimes in 4, sometimes in 3, sometimes in 1. And a regular cycle that looks something like this, where every 2 weeks you're starting and doing sprint planning and coming up with a list of things that become your Scrum backlog that the dev team is committing to achieving in a way where they're functional and tested and completed at the end of the cycle, and cycles within cycles, where every day you're checking in with each other and asking questions like, is anything blocking me, or how's it going in general? So 2 backlogs: product backlog, this giant list of all the things that you'd like to do with your product, and the sprint log backlog, which is this smaller thing that you're pulling things into every cycle. And this being the actual act, pulling things in. User stories. I think we're all probably familiar with this as well. So, brief descriptions of features, typically describing from an end user perspective what sort of functionality you want to put together and why. So things that fit the format of, not always, but when it makes sense, as an X, I want Y to achieve Z, that sort of thing. And they are not meant to be the requirements themselves. They're not meant to capture everything and boil it down to this sort of one pure thought that explains everything. They're meant to be reminders, sort of mnemonic cursors that allow us to have a conversation with people that are involved in building this and stakeholders that will be using it and that sort of thing as we're building, as we're doing the actual development. They're reminders of what that conversation should be about, but they're not meant in any way, shape, or form to capture everything and sort of boil it down to this one perfect thought. An example of that is an end user. I want to see intuitive error messages when I fill a form in incorrectly so that I know how to correct my mistakes and complete a form submission. Sometimes we couple user stories with acceptance criteria, so something like, as a user, I'm required to have an email address that contains a valid top-level domain, so that if I put in bob@binky.binky, I'm going to get a validation message. But if I put it bob@binky.com, it's going to pass. Often found on index cards, or if you're working in systems like Jira and in issues within Jira as well. Often estimated with relative sizing. Is that a concept that everybody's familiar with? It's a notion of like, okay, so sometimes people estimate user stories with sort of like ideal person hours. So I think that in an ideal world where I wasn't being interrupted or distracted by other things, if I sat down and just sort of did work on this, it would get done in 10 hours. That's sort of one method. But a lot of people also use story points or t-shirt size and that sort of thing. So you might say, as a group, when you're doing group estimation, and group estimation is meant to be a process that replaces Delphi estimation, which was this thing that was fairly popular like late 90s, early 2000s, where you would pay some consultant company that would come into your company and they would help you do estimation by sort of blindly interviewing different people that were involved, getting their estimates, and then boiling them down to something that was sort of a merge of all the different estimations. And when people came up with the notion of story points and scrum poker and that sort of stuff, the notion was, let's take that process, which was really expensive, involved consultants, and boil it down to a deck of cards. So quite often when you're doing estimation, you've got people that have these cards which represent the Fibonacci sequence. So some numbers from 0 to 1/2 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 to 8, 13. It's actually slightly modified, not pure Fibonacci, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, that sort of a thing. And you sit around a room with developers or whoever's involved in estimation, often test people, often anybody, designers that are part of the process. You look at user stories and you discuss the work that's involved around them, and then you come up with an estimate. And the story poker method allows everybody to sort of pull out a card and say, I think this is 1 point, and somebody else says it's 3 points, and somebody else says it's 5 points. But because you all do it at the same time, you've got that sort of blind aspect that you get out of that Delphi estimation experience that you were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for before, but you get it sort of instantaneously and on the cheap. And it becomes a focal point for discussion as everybody sort of says, well, I think it's 5 points for this reason, I think it's 3 points for this reason. And ultimately you boil it down to an estimate that makes sense to everybody, that everybody can agree on. And not meant to be pure and exact, but meant to be something that gives you sort of relative sizing of this story that's about adding a widget to the page that displays blog posts is 3 times as complicated as this one that talks about changing the login process or something along those lines. Allows you to apply numbers to your user stories, and through those numbers get a sense of over time of what your velocity as a development team is. So, can we do 20 story points worth of work in a 2-week period? Can we do 30 story points worth of work? And through that empirical evidence, be able to sort of plan out and estimate how much work you can take on in any given period. Does that make sense to everybody? And user stories typically group together in epics. So if you've got 3 user stories that are sort of pointing in the same direction to fulfill a particular task or create a particular piece of functionality, an epic's a way to bind them together. So a question I'll pose to you folks, especially because it seems like everybody here has some amount of Agile experience, is what makes for that sort of ideal product backlog? What sorts of things do we want to see in it? Anyone have any ideas?
Do you mean with the fact that it should be prioritized, like in order?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
With like things somewhere near the top having been estimated.
Yeah, that sounds good. Any other ideas, Barca?
We need to have a prioritized product backlog where when we go for sprint planning, we can just put up the amount of stories that we want from the top.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely want sort of detailed tickets at the top that are ideally, if we've got 20 points of capacity, the 20 points at the top of our backlog should pretty much represent what we're going to bring into the next sprint. We should be that prepared as we're going into like a sprint planning meeting, that sort of thing. So when I answered this question, my thoughts were similar to yours. We want something that's well groomed and managed by a product owner, somebody that's sort of dedicated to keeping that product backlog in good shape. It's prioritized, usually by business value, that reflects the vision. If your organization's having visions, I guess maybe you're in trouble. The vision and the goals of your organization. That has few enough user stories that it's something that one person can hold in their head. So if you have 4,000 tickets in your backlog, even if you spend a couple of days, I don't know that you're really going to go through that and get to the end of it and be able to sort of conceive of, this is where the product is probably going. So it's nice if it's, as developers say, like grokkable, if it's something that you can hold in your head and conceive of.
How would you deal with, so for example, our backlog currently has, I think, 920 tickets.
Okay.
So it's not grokkable.
It's not at all uncommon. I'm going to get into that towards the end, but I've got the same problem. I'll give it away right now, and I've got some ideas because I've been trying to solve that. It's something that has well articulated user stories. Something that has more detail, as you mentioned, Matt, at the top and minimal detail at the bottom. Something that makes use of things like epics to group things that are related together in a way that makes sense. So I'll ask the opposite question, which is what don't we want to see in an ideal backlog? Any thoughts?
Wouldn't that be the opposite?
That would be the opposite of all those things. So I'll list those out. An undergroomed and backlog that's managed by somebody that's maybe overburdened or maybe not managed by anybody at all. Something that's only partially prioritized, something that reflects, I was getting a little poetic here, the mad whims of people that are unfamiliar with the product or the organization. I was trying to say the opposite of something that reflects the organization's goals and vision. Something that has 900 or thousands of vague user stories that no one person can possibly comprehend or properly comprehend. Something that has user stories along the lines of red filament needs to be backwards or redact the left one. Things that nobody other than the person that sort of jotted it off 4 years ago or 2 years ago or 3 months ago can really properly understand. Something has a bunch of stories at the bottom that are full of paragraphs of information about things that you want to do, but has a whole bunch of tickets at the top that have less detail. And something that doesn't have mechanisms in place to tie related tickets together. So I do have a confession to make, and I sort of already alluded to it. And that's that I have a less than ideal product backlog right now, which is something that's a little bit new to me. I mean, not entirely. Matt works at McGill where I worked previously, and when I left McGill, I don't think the number was 900, but there were certainly a substantial number of tickets in the backlog. But I've been fairly fortunate in my career to have backlogs that were fairly well organized, especially at the Linux Foundation, where we had like 4 teams and 4 separate backlogs and multiple people doing the sort of product owner role and a fair amount of work being done to make sure that the tickets at the top were properly detailed and that stakeholders had been consulted, and that when we got to sprint planning, it was more a conversation about what to to do with the tickets that we knew we were undertaking rather than what tickets we were going to undertake, things along those lines. And so I've been asking myself the question, how did we get to a place at Remote where we have a backlog that is suboptimal? And these are my answers, that we are a startup. So, a year ago we were 5 people, now we're 10. There is no product owner really. I mean, I'm playing that role sort of, but I'm also spending 90% of my time doing development work. We have a dev team of 4 people, 3 devs and QA analysts, Barca. And yeah, we're likely still a long way away from being able to pay the salary of somebody that's just going to sit there and keep that backlog in line, which is definitely not ideal. We're ambitious and we're creative, like a lot of startups. So we, I think, have ideas at a rate of about 10 to 1 in terms of what we can implement versus what we think we'd like to implement, which means that backlog is not shrinking over time. It's continuing to grow, it's continuing to expand, and that's something that we don't necessarily want to push back against. I mean, the startups especially, I think, tend to thrive on ingenuity and on ideas, so you don't want to tell people to pipe down and wait till we've got the capacity to look at other ideas in the future. I think you want to keep the door open to that sort of thing. So finding a way to deal with that's a bit tricky. And I will say this, I think we, and by we, I think I mean me, had lost touch a little bit with Scrum basics in terms of particularly the thing that you mentioned, Matt, about making sure that you've got that level of detail at the top and less detail at the bottom. I think I'd gotten a little bit intoxicated by the lure of having a fully estimated backlog and making sure that I had story points on everything so that I could have this sort of quantifiable number of all this work that we probably weren't ever going to get around to, and could watch it grow from quarter to quarter or from sprint to sprint, and I'm recognizing now that there isn't a great deal of value with that. I mean, I guess if you're in a position where for some reason you're definitely going to do all of that work and somebody wants to put together estimates around it about, how many additional teams should I bring in and, spend thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of dollars to solve those sorts of problems, then maybe it's useful. But if you're not in a position where your team size is going to double overnight or something magical like that, I think that it likely doesn't have a whole lot of value. And so I've done a lot of thinking, trying to find the appropriate path for us back to sanity, and I think these 5 steps make the most sense to me at this point, and recently implemented seem to be bringing about a significant and beneficial change. So step 1, clear and simple backlog grooming goals. Step 2, better prioritization processes. Step 3, minimization of focus, and I think this may even be the most important one, really making sure that not only focusing to make sure that we have a greater level of detail at the top of the backlog, but we're focusing the time that we spend caring about the backlog, maintaining that backlog, grooming that backlog on those top tickets. Giving backlog items a shelf life, and this is my solution for the 900 ticket backlog, and I'll get into it in more detail in a second. And then finally, assigning tasks coming out of backlog grooming to make sure that action is taken when needed to get things appropriately done. So clear and simple backlog grooming goals. That's almost a tongue twister. We want our backlog to fill 3 capacity limited buckets, and by capacity limit I mean we know that our dev team and story points are totally arbitrary. So one team may do 20 story points. One team of 10 people may do 20 story points, and one team of 4 people may do 40 story points, and it doesn't matter a hill of beans because that measure is specific to that team. It doesn't mean that one's better than the other or anything along those lines. It's just how they happen to estimate things. But we know that our capacity is let's say 35 story points. That means that our bucket for short-term tickets is going to be 35 times 3. It's going to be 105 story points. Our bucket for medium tickets is going to be 4 sprints worth of stories, and it should be slightly more than that, 140 story points, that sort of a thing. And our long-term bucket is going to be whatever. We don't care what the number is. We don't care how many tickets are in it. We sort of do, but it just doesn't matter. We're not worried about overflowing it. It can take it. And yeah, that short-term bucket is meant to be small, detailed, estimated, actionable stories, things that could go immediately into a sprint, or at least into a sprint planning discussion. Medium-term tickets, stories are going to be much more things that need to be broken down, like an 8-point ticket about sort of a lofty goal that can be split into 3 separate user stories, that sort of thing. Better prioritization processes. So I've already mentioned these 3 sorts of categories, like short, medium, or long term. So making sure that all of our stories are put into those different categories, and that we're respecting those capacity limits on the short and medium categories. So that acts as a sort of gate for bringing a new ticket into medium. We have to make sure that that many points worth of stuff has gone out of the medium bucket. We ensure that we're not, I just said that. I considered Moscow for this as well. Is everybody familiar with Moscow? So Moscow, I don't know where it came out of, I think it's a PMI thing, is another prioritization scheme where you categorize the work that you have to do as must have, M for Moscow, could have, C for Moscow, must have, should have, could have, won't have. So should is the S in Moscow, and C is the C, and whatever. So you have 4 categories, and won't have is you basically just turfing something, saying we're never going to do this. In the end, short, medium, long term makes more sense to me because it's 3 categories instead of 4. It just seems easier to work with. I considered business value points. Is everybody familiar with that concept? So the notion is much like story points. You do estimation with people that are on the business side of your business in terms of the business value of each of your stories. So if you've got 20 user stories in your backlog, you sit down with the people that are on the business side, and you have them go through and use those same cards to play a similar poker game that we're doing with the estimation for story points to do business value points. And through that, you get these things that stand out as we think this is 80 points of business value. We think this is 40, we think this is only 1. And then the notion is that if you do some math against it, you're looking for those stories that have a high business value point and a really low story value point, because if there's something that's 1 point to implement, but the business side sees it as 80 points of value, why not do that first above everything else?
Is that something you suggest one product owner does, or like multiple people, like planning poker style?
It's planning poker style, and it's typically not the development team that's doing that business value. It's the people that are on the business side of the organization, which might be a bit tricky in a university scenario where the business side of your organization is like 3,500 people or something like that.
Like a group of key stakeholders.
But yeah,
or something.
let's say you're a medium-sized company, and there's a sales team and a communication team and a strategic team that are sort of pushing for the various things that end up in your backlog. If you get a key group of them together, run them through the exercise, then you get sort of their input on how valuable different things are, and then you contrast that with the amount of effort needed to develop something to determine which thing sort of stands out as being an easy win.
Would you consider doing that just at the epic level? If you've got 1,000 stories?
Might be. What I've been doing, and this is more into sort of the release planning side of things and less into sort of day-to-day backlog grooming, but what we do is a release planning meeting once every quarter. We sit down, and right now we're only 10 people. We bring all 10 people into a meeting together, and we give them each $100 virtual dollars. And we look at all the epics of things that we haven't done yet that we want to do, and usually, it's 20 sort of high-level things. And we put them into a spreadsheet, and people spend their virtual dollars, and then we do the math. So the CEO has 100 virtual dollars to spend, the support person has 100 virtual dollars to spend. I mean, probably not every organization is going to go for that scheme exactly. We're fairly lucky because we treat things pretty flat, but everybody's sort of got an equal say, and through that we get this interesting picture emerging of, the salespeople think that this has got value, and it's a neat way to sort of push things to the top.
When you do that exercise, do each of the tickets have like the same value, or do you go and say this one will cost you 5 and this one will cost you 1?
We're just doing it at the epic level, and we are giving rough estimates to stuff so people can see that, if we've got 120 or 160 points of capacity in a quarter generally, or whatever it is, they can see that this ticket here to add in this whole new API is going to take a third of our time for the quarter if it goes in. Whereas this thing here, which is this nice little UX feature, is it's half a sprint's worth of work, that sort of thing. So that's part of it, and we usually do a couple of different rounds. So we do, and it's all done in a Google sheet live, so everybody sees what everybody else is doing. We do one round where people spend their money, and we go through, and everybody in the room says, I spent $50 on infrastructure because we don't want our servers to go down, and we know that our traffic is doubling weekly or something like that. And people make their case. Everybody goes back and makes some adjustments, and they're being a little bit clever when they see it, because they see that the first time around, these things that they put $5 in, nobody else voted for, so they move stuff around a little bit. But once we get to the end of that second round, we pin things down, and that has, for my time in the organization so far, been our process for figuring out what we're going to do in a particular quarter.
So when you give them, so if you have prices and you give them like these virtual dollars, you give them, you mentioned 160 and 100, so you give them enough money that they can buy about 2/3 of what's there, so that's like, what's the ratio?
So the dollars do not correspond to the store points in any way, shape, or form. And I made the mistake once of giving people 200 when we had 200 store points of capacity, and I just sowed all sorts of confusion, which I wouldn't ever want to do again. But no, the notion is simply that these are allowing people to have a mechanism to say, whatever our capacity is, these are from in an ascending or descending order, these are the top 10 things that we as an organization want to tackle, and we'll just take a look at those, figure out what their point values are, and bring in whatever fits.
What are the constraints? Like you're talking about capacity. Is it capacity of your team, or the budget capacity?
No, it's definitely capacity of the team. So because we're estimating the story points, and we can see that over time we've proven that our capacity is basically 35 story points. We know that we should, in every sprint, bring in pretty much exactly 35 story points, or we're working with a buffer, for that sort of unexpected stuff. So maybe 30 story points plus a buffer, 5 story points for some bug that gets discovered at 4 a.m. that's really urgent or something along those lines. It's empirically determined capacity from after you run 2 or 3 sprints. You can see, based on these story point estimations, how many points worth of tickets your team is able to put through in a given sprint.
And what about the budget? Like, if you're working and you see that you're going to get over budget?
It's interesting.
I mean, this is from my perspective, because I work mostly with small organizations.
So I guess, are you in a position where when you're doing development on something, it's sort of a set number of people doing the development, or is it the sort of thing where based on the budget that team size might sort of go up and down over time?
No,
Or?
we have like 1 or 2 workers, usually 2 workers if it's a budget around more than $10,000 something like that. It's,
Got
a
it.
big budget for us is like $50,000,
Okay.
75 sometimes.
Um,
So
and that would be work that would be undertaken over months or over?
it depends of our capacity, but
Okay.
I think it was like 2 or 3 months.
And I guess your teams are typically, do you have a team that's working on multiple projects at one time, I guess?
Also,
Yeah. That's a tough one. So the closest I have, so I've been in some weird positions, like McGill, I think you saw Matt's presentation yesterday. It's a service that's completely open to the 35,000 people that populate the university. So there's no bill that gets paid to Matt's team, or at least not when I was there for work done on stuff. They definitely got a budget that they work within for the year, but it's not like when somebody comes to them and asks for a new piece of functionality, if they choose to bring that in, that there's a charge. The LF was a little bit different because we were doing Drupal sort of brochure sites for the most part to different people, but they were productized enough and sort of similar enough that we knew each one of those things would cost us, give or take $20,000 or $25,000, and we'd put it together in a week with a team of 3 or something like that. So most of the time it didn't sort of go into that range, and when it did, when it was something that was really big, usually we were working with vendors, so that was sort of impacting our budget as well. So yeah, I don't know if I have great answers for somebody that's in exactly your position. I mean, I can tell you that I don't feel great about it, but when somebody asks me to give an estimate on something, if I have a rough notion and story points of how much work it's going to take, I will sometimes translate that to dollars just based on sort of sketchy
this
math.
Is another part of my interrogation, because we're not paid while we're doing the code.
Right.
And then we start the first sprint and we delve into details. Like we try to do that with the client before we do the code, but usually we realize.
So I think the answer I have for you is that, and I think you would find that if you talk to the majority of people that are running like Drupal dev shops, and I certainly see this from having been on the from being on the hiring side of people that's hiring people that do Drupal dev shops on a regular basis, I don't think most people are doing contracts where it's a set price. I think most people are doing contracts where it's based on the hourly
That's what we're telling our clients, but they never get it.
Well, I mean, go ahead, Matt. You probably got more experience
Clients
than I
hate
do.
that, I was just going to say.
The clients hate that, but I think it's become the standard for most agencies to the point where it's pretty hard to find somebody that's going to do differently. I mean, you can build in certain protections and
Yeah, we do that all the time, but it seems that it's hard to communicate that to the clients.
totally.
But we tell them like all the time, like
I guess what I
fix it code. We can't do everything. We do our best, respect the budget and the time, but you have to prioritize. And
what I have seen work as well, and not everybody's going to like this either, and I realize we're getting a little bit off track, but I think we've still got lots of time. What I have seen work is if you do a paid discovery phase followed by a paid development phase. So you say, give us $5,000. We'll spend the next week going through your requirements and doing that more thorough estimation and getting a clear picture, and then we can come back to you with what it's going to cost.
we try
But
to do
that scares people as well.
The smaller ones,
Sorry, I don't have any fantastic answers for you on that, but I know it's definitely something that a lot of people wrestle with. All right. Using urgent tags. So if somebody creates a new user story and adds it to the backlog, tagging it as urgent causes us to look at it in our weekly backlog grooming to see if it should go into that medium bucket or that small bucket. Making sure that we're using epics as epics should be used, not as a sort of a way to bind things that are one component of the system architecture together, but more things that would actually be work that's undertaken at once to add some particular feature to a product. You can definitely use other tagging mechanisms to say, this is all stuff related to the call tool or to the fax tool or whatever, using language from our place of work, but epics really should be stuff that would be typically undertaken in one fell swoop. Doesn't necessarily have to be in one sprint, but related work that's moved forward at the same time. Minimize focus. So spending the majority of our grooming time, roughly 75%, on short-term stories, promoting stories from medium to short-term. Spending 20% of our grooming time on that medium-term stuff, getting it ready to be sort of promotable into short-term, and getting the work of breaking those 8-point tickets up into 2-point tickets or 3-point tickets or what have you. And then 5% of our time on that long-term stuff. Just for the most part, taking a look at it, recognizing it's there, but other than occasionally promoting stuff up to that medium level, leaving it alone. Give backlog items a shelf life, and this is my solution for the 900 ticket backlog, is remove or filter out any user stories that haven't been discussed, or if you're using something like Jira, haven't been updated in over X days. And for us, X days is 120 days. And this doesn't mean that you drop them out of the system or delete them. It just means that you put a filter in place where day to day you just don't see them. And if somebody comes up 6 months from now and says, hey, what about that really awesome idea that we talked about and we detailed in a Jira issue but never got around to, it's still reachable, searchable, findable through the system somewhere, but it's just, if somebody hasn't cared enough about it to mention it for 120 days in a row, you just shuffle it off the map.
All the tickets you opened.
What's that? All the tickets I opened, exactly. Yeah. Assigning tasks and backlog grooming. So if as we're doing that grooming, especially of that top short-term list of things, questions come up that need answering, making sure that when we leave that backlog grooming, somebody has an actionable task to answer that question. So if we can't really move forward with estimating something or even deciding how it should be prioritized until a particular question is answered, like, does an API exist that would allow us to do this without having to build it from scratch, or things along those lines, assigning it to somebody so that when you come back to it at your next backlog grooming in a week's time or however long, you've got an opportunity to have that answer and to react to it. So in short, keeping things simple, providing the dev team with detailed stories, and make backlog grooming an efficient process that a small team can manage. Some reading that I did on the subject to try and come up with our semi-cohesive plan. Link to my slides. And yeah.
Can I see the link
Oh yeah, sorry.
please?
So yeah, any other thoughts, questions, ideas? I definitely don't feel like I've got all this worked out in perfection, but I feel like I put measures in place that will allow us to move forward in a slightly more efficient manner without being sort of bogged down, especially by the weight of a backlog that will never, ever be reduced in size.
Yeah, I think we open tickets at a faster pace than we close them. So, yeah, see where that's heading.
Yeah.
I mean, a problem we have in planning now is that anyone is allowed to go and change the priority of things in the backlog, which means there's sort of this like, oh, you bumped yours up, so I'm up above mine, so I'm going to bump mine up above yours scheme
It's
going on.
sort of an arms race, sort of.
Yeah, so like, yeah, like and then you've got like, I mean, the interesting things could be anywhere in the top like 30 or 40, so you can't just drag down the thing in Jira and say, well, next sprint, let's take the top 10 and like go down until you've hit your number of story points and you're done. But we need to be more formal about how things are prioritized and do that in like specific meetings or assign that role to somebody.
Yeah, I mean ideally that prioritization should have the weight and the authority of a product owner who's making that final decision. And I think if you don't have somebody that's got that authority or who's sort of making that their day-to-day focus, it can get really tricky really fast. Somebody needs to be able to sort of and not to ignore stakeholders or anything like that. And I think that was a lot of my challenge at the LF was, I had to meet the events team, which was a third of our business, once every 2 weeks, and make sure that I understood their priorities. And then I had to meet with the training team, which was a third of our business, and make sure I understood their priorities and so on and so forth with the different aspects of the business. But then ultimately having the authority to decide, this particular events thing is more important than this particular training thing or something along those lines. Somebody needs to be able to make that final decision.
Yeah.
Or you have to have unique, separate dev teams under each aspect of your business so that you're not in conflict.
Right. So that requires, like, when a stakeholder who has, like a product owner who has the time to be familiar enough with the user stories so that they can meaningfully do the prioritization.
Oh yeah, for sure. What I would say, because I did my Scrum Master ticket like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, quite a while back, and then I did the product owner training fairly recently, right before I started New Modes, maybe 2 years ago now, something like that. I think that product owner course is not to show for anybody or whatnot, but I think for the money spent, it's pretty valuable, and anybody that's in that position should definitely have gone through it, because it gives you a much different perspective than how they train Scrum Masters. It lets you sort of look at things from a different point of view.
I know there's a variety of like consultants offering these trainings. Is there ones in particular that you recommend, or have from your own experience?
I mean, they all. I mean, all the Scrum ones are managed by Scrum Alliance, but you're right, there's a whole bunch of different vendors. The one I took and was happy with was a guy, I think somewhere out of Ontario, called Agile Pain Relief. Mark
Okay.
Lepin or Levine or something like that.
Ottawa something.
Yeah. I can't quite recall. I think you're right. I think he's in Ottawa. And he holds them fairly often.
Yeah.
But I think, if you felt like you were in a place where whoever was in that position wasn't sort of wielding that full authority, I think giving them the background of that course would at least put them in a position to realize sort of what the expectation is in order to make the process as efficient as possible.
The time constraint might be is as important as like training or like taking a training or experience part. So,
Yeah, I'm sure it is. But
if that's where that's blocking, I'm not immediately sure what to do about that, because it's difficult to delegate half the role of a product owner to a different person, because it's ideally something that one person can hold in their head.
Yeah, I agreed. And there's certainly product owners that manage multiple projects, but you're in a difficult situation if your product owner is somebody who has 4 other hats that they're wearing and
Or is in too many meetings.
Yeah. it's sort of the position that we're in because we don't really technically have a product owner per se. We're just
Right.
winging it.
Because you're doing, you've got too many dev responsibilities.
Pretty much
Focus on that role.
90% of my time should be in dev or dev-related meetings. So,
Right.
yeah.
Hmm.
Anyway, it seems to have helped so far. I'll report back in 6 months and let you know if I'm still happy. How are we doing for time? 10 minutes, perfect. I'm gonna leave it there, and then unless folks have any more questions. Do you know if I have to hit the red button again?